I'm Joe Gioconda. I am a lawyer, but my hobby and my passion has been to collect and display rare props and costumes used in movies, particularly in the horror movie genre, which is something that I've enjoyed really my entire life. And so while I've been attracted to collecting props and costumes from all different types of movies, over the years I've been focused on really trying to get props and costumes that I would see in movies and particularly horror movies that I enjoyed. I would seek those out. My interest in horror movies goes back to when I was a kid. I remember distinctly that I watched The Exorcist. I'm dating myself, but I watched it when it first came out, and it made quite an impression on me as a young guy. And then over the years, movies like Pet Sematary, over the years, those types of movies always really kind of intrigued me because they had such a powerful impact on both the readers of the book and the viewers of the movie. And so I've always been particularly interested in the horror genre, both reading books and then watching films, especially adaptations of books. And so I think over the years my interest was in horror movies, and then probably about 25 years ago I started discovering that not only could you collect movie posters, which is something a lot of people do, and autographs, which again is something that I was always interested in, trying to get movie posters signed by directors and actors of my favorite films. But I started to discover that you could get movie props and costumes that would actually be left over sometimes from those movies. What I found out first was that there was a big market for Star Wars and for movies like that because they had a huge fan base, Star Trek and Star Wars in particular. And so there was a pretty vibrant community of people buying and selling those. I was also intrigued not just with horror, but I was also intrigued with old mob movies. So I was always curious, can you get something from The Godfather or something like that? And it became a fun hobby because the hunt itself was really half the fun, or more than half the fun maybe. You get to reach out to people who worked on the films, other collectors who are also really avid collectors of that genre. Sometimes even actors, when you would see them at a convention or something like that, you would ask them for their autograph on the poster, but you might even ask them if they kept anything from films they worked on. So it was a fun topic of conversation. And over the years, as I said, because I was attracted to horror, I would get bits and pieces from horror films in particular, and really just kept them, right? They were the kind of thing that weren't easy to display. Even some of this was before the internet, so in many cases it was in my house, in storage, in the basement, not something that I could really easily enjoy with other people. So A Nightmare in New Hope was my attempt to share my collection and my passion with other fans. As I said, a lot of times I would acquire these rare pieces costumes, props, and so forth. And the only way I could really share them would be with friends or family, some of which have really, aren't particularly interested in this stuff, or on the internet. And that's always a fun thing to do, is find communities online, either on Facebook or on Reddit or in other groups where you can find people around the world who share their passion and share pictures. But it's just not the same. Seeing a picture on a screen of something that's in a museum somewhere else isn't as satisfying as seeing it firsthand, real close up, maybe even being able to touch it. And I was surprised to find out over the years that there were so few museums and galleries dedicated to this. There are a couple. There are a couple in Los Angeles. Of course, the Hollywood Museum in the Max Factor building is probably the biggest, or one of the biggest. And in the basement there, they have a really cool exhibit of horror movie props. They have the original set from Silence of the Lambs. That is a really great museum. And then a few smaller ones have popped up. Mystic Museum on the West Coast. There were a few others, but they often closed. Particularly, they were all on the West Coast. So on the East Coast, there was virtually nothing. There was a little museum in Salem, Massachusetts. That was really about it. I was surprised to find there was so little. And when the Museum of the Moving Image opened in Queens, New York, that made me realize that that is something that there is a real interest in film, television, but particularly in horror, since people were always gravitating toward that. So I thought, rather than keep my collection private, I really wanted to open it to the public and really find a way to share it. What I discovered was that this is a very popular concept, a very popular gallery, both in season, so to speak, during the warmer months and Halloween season, of course, but year round. I think people really have seen a resurgence, a renaissance in the horror movie genre. It's become really mainstream, some really great productions in recent years. And so A Nightmare on New Hope was my attempt to share with the world my passion and my collection. So one of the first things that people are able to see when they walk into the gallery is this is an original screen-used casket from Tales from the Crypt. It was particularly used in Bordello of Blood. And what's really cool about it is that it's made of real wood, hand-carved, it weighs a ton, full size. And what's really cool about props like this is they weren't making them out of cheap resin and like they might today, make it out of plastic or something. These are works of art that carpenters work on. Could take them weeks or a month to make. They might only make one for filming, and so this casket, when it was banged up with axes and so forth in the scene, you can actually still see the axe marks where it was used on screen. So that's a really fun piece that brings people back to the Tales from the Crypt days. And along those lines, one of the fun things I have is a big box of individual props, one of which was used in every episode of Tales from the Crypt over the years. And people remember these episodes. They remember when Harry Anderson was drawing the cartoon characters, the comic book characters, and come to life. And here's his watch that he was wearing in the scene, or the badge worn in season 6. And of course, one of the earliest episodes, the bulging eyeball that was from season 1, episode 6. And what's really cool is I have an item from one of every episode of Tales from the Crypt over the years. So I'm able to showcase a few of those. And people, when they think of Tales from the Crypt, they're just amazed that that's a part of their upbringing, something that they remember very fondly growing up with and watching fairly frequently as young people. That really may have gotten them interested in the horror genre. Also over here, another couple of pieces that bring people back to their memories of early horror. Pet Sematary, one of the scariest movies, in my opinion, scariest adaptations of a Stephen King book. This is an original arm that was made out of prosthetic, really fairly low quality, really just a couple of wooden dowels with a brake caliper. That's the original scalpel that Gage, Miko Hughes, the actor, as a little kid, slices Fred Gwynne's Achilles tendon, one of the most horribly memorable scenes at the end of that film. And here is a production made prosthetic of Fred Gwynn's ankle. Fred Gwynn's ankle was not actually cut. It was a prosthetic leg. You can see where the scalpel would have entered it. It's been put on a display here, but when people see that, they shudder because they remember distinctly when Judd Crandall, played by Fred Gwynn, had his Achilles tendon sliced. Another example of history of horror. This is one of the 7 daggers of Megiddo from the original Omen trilogy. People remember the Omen again from their youth, perhaps. This is one of the daggers that could only those daggers could kill the Antichrist. If you remember when Buchenhagen presents those, and they're used throughout the movies to ultimately kill Sam Neill, who ultimately becomes the Antichrist. One of the more recent horror films from recent years that people claim is one of the scariest ones they've ever seen is the Sinister movies. And this is an original, what they call a hero mask. That is one of the original face masks that was used on screen during Sinister 2, and you can see here this is original. It's been applied to a permanent fixture for display, and this was preserved by the special effects guys who worked on the film for posterity, and so now it's on display here in the gallery. One of people's most favorite horror comedy films of the last few decades is Shaun of the Dead. People just love it. They remember it. It's become kind of a cult classic for horror and comedy. And I'm excited that I have 3 of the most valuable and rarest items from Shaun of the Dead. Here we have the shirt worn by Simon Pegg as Shaun. You can see the blood spatter. People remember the leaking red pen. You've got red on you. And you can see all the blood spatter from the zombies and the hands wiping the blood. And we have screenshots here where you can screen match it directly. Here's the other shirt that was worn in Shaun of the Dead. So we have together 2 of the main wardrobe items from the film, and the beat up cricket bat, or what's left of it, when Simon Pegg is using that cricket bat in order to whack all of the zombies. So this is the first time these 3 items have been together in the last 20 years since the filming production ended. In this section, I've created a dedicated section to the Conjuring Universe, so to speak. And these are films that were created around the Conjuring theme. What we have over here are the original prototype parts of what eventually became the iconic Annabelle doll. When special effects designers play around with materials in order to create ultimately what they're going to use on screen, these items are remnants, or what's left over, and then ultimately we have the master bust of Annabelle. This was used in the original Conjuring film. What's fascinating about it is the eyeballs were actually removed from the master bust and used in the stunt dolls throughout the movie. So if you would see the doll in a case, like in the Warrens Occult Museum scene, the stunt doll is there, but it's the same eyes that appear in both the close-ups from this doll as well as the Warrens Occult Museum, and that's done for continuity purposes so that when the viewer is looking, they're seeing essentially the same face or the same eyes from scene to scene. Also in this section, we have the original books that were used in the Conjuring The Devil Made Me Do It sequel. Amazing quality is the detail, the attention to detail and the quality in these materials, all handmade by special effects people and set dressers who work on these films. And here we have the original costume, the habit, worn by Bonnie Aarons in the Conjuring film The Nun. So this section here is dedicated to the Conjuring universe, and my goal is to keep acquiring new and more materials from Conjuring films, both the originals and new ones as they come out, because I believe this has been a very influential franchise for the horror genre in recent years. There's no one way to get your hands on a rare movie prop for any genre. What happens, as I discovered in the movie industry, is that special effects designers set designers, set dressers, all of these people work mostly on set and mostly in Hollywood, although that's changed even over the years as people travel on location and sets have become more diverse in terms of location. And set dressers and prop masters would traditionally, when they were in Los Angeles, they would rent their props. They would go to very large prop houses, such as at Warner Brothers, and they would just take stuff off the rack and they would put it on their characters, on their actors and actresses. And then when the filming and production was over, they would just send it back. So what I found was over the years, some of the greatest movies, going back to Gone with the Wind and Lawrence of Arabia and so forth, that stuff was off the rack. It wasn't set aside by anyone after a great film was done, because it was used in 20, 30, 40 films. Sometimes the same gun was used in every cowboy, every Western film for decades. But as the industry got more specialized, as the expectations went up in terms of the quality of items and special effects, and as the resolution of film itself became better, a lot of the prop masters and set dressers would actually create or acquire custom items. But when a production ends, whether it's a movie or a television program, there's usually no budget from the production company to keep anything. They're really, when a production is a one-time deal for the most part, when production ends, if the items weren't rented, they are scattered to the four winds. Even special effects items, they're not usually recycled because they're usually very specific to the production. Sometimes the director will keep a piece or two. Sometimes the set dressers themselves, the special effects designers, even production assistants, and the actors and actresses themselves may actually keep a piece or two. But we're not talking about typically that large productions have large budgets for permanent storage of their items. And I discovered that this was therefore a lost art in a sense, because you had people put their their livelihood, put their heart and soul into creating these beautiful production items, whether they be incredible costumes or special effects items, and then they're gone. They may be lost to time, to history, but in many cases, little pieces survived. And so what I discovered was that these were rare works of art, essentially, that there was tremendous interest in, but no real supply. In other words, a movie was made once, that's it. The movie was, it's not going to be made again typically, and even a remake is going to start from scratch. They're not going to use props from 20 or 30 years ago. So over time, items from films become more rare, more scarce. And we're not just talking about the iconic pieces like the ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, right? Which just, by the way, sold at auction for over $30 million. Okay, we're not talking only about iconic items like that. We're talking about movies from 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Movies like E.T., movies like Poltergeist, movies, more run-of-the-mill movies that are not necessarily big budget or very high tech. It could be a movie that's just got a cult following. These movies are, people get excited about them, but over time, the props and costumes from those movies are usually lost. So how do you acquire them? There's no one way. There are companies dedicated to auctioning them off. There's a company called Prop Store. There's a large auction company called Heritage Auctions, Julien's Auctions. Sometimes they make their way to Christie's or Sotheby's or some of the large auction houses. On the other hand, sometimes something may show up on eBay. But most of the time it's coming through other collectors in a small community of people, or people who actually worked on set, and those people kept the items. And years later, they decided to part with them for one reason or another, and they get to know typically who the collectors are, who the dedicated collectors are. They may reach out, or they may consign those items with auction houses. And so if you're interested in a genre or in general movie props, there are lots of ways you can keep your eyes out for what may become available. The problem has become from a collector's standpoint is that the number of collectors and the level of collectors has become so great that the prices to acquire these items, especially the rare items, has become astronomical. But for those of us who are dedicated to really caring about the art, the film industry, and the hobby, and those of us who really care about the details, when we do find a piece and we are able to be lucky enough to afford it or acquire it, we don't lightly let it go, right? These are objects of art that when they find their way into the hands of true collectors, they may not be seen again. And so some of the great props in history and wardrobe items aren't seen in public. They exchange hands and they're never seen again. And that's unfortunate. And that's one of the reasons I opened the gallery, was that I wanted people to know that something like the shirt that was worn in Shaun of the Dead with the blood spatter on it, or the original Annabelle doll used in The Conjuring, and things like that, do still exist in collectors' private collections, but they really should be shared in a sense with the public. It reminds me of Indiana Jones saying that belongs in a museum. My goal with Nightmare and New Hope is to continue to add rare props and costumes, both from classic horror films and new horror films as they come out and are successful. Really, it's to grow. Any physical museum or gallery is really limited by budget and obviously space. And you want to be accessible. So having a museum or a gallery of horror props and costumes really needs to find the right location. And I looked at locations all around the country for this. As I said, there are some successes on the West Coast, but I'm not moving to the West Coast to open a gallery. So being on the East Coast, I looked at New York, I looked at New England, I live here in Pennsylvania and split my time with New York. So I looked in these areas and I found that New Hope, Pennsylvania was kind of an off the beaten path locale that's really fascinating, because it's got a real entertainment community that shares its time with New York and with Philadelphia, and being close to Princeton. There are a lot of big time celebrities moving into the area, but Bucks County and New Hope have always embraced an alternative group of people who were seeking a haven away from the big Hollywood and New York establishment. And so I found that this is a great place to be located, because it doesn't have to be New York on Times Square or Fifth Avenue. It can be here. Tremendous interest in it here. Great pedestrian traffic, great interest. So over the next few years, what I'd really like to do is go from a basement gallery here into something that's much larger, and can also expand into what would be my dream, an institute, a place where we can bring people who are involved in the actual film industry, whether they be independent creators, directors, writers, producers, actors, and actresses, and bring them in and actually engage them in some seminars and some conventions, some get-togethers and things. I'd love to work together with some of the horror conventions in the area. There's some great ones like Monster Mania that have tremendous success several times a year. And I'd love to work more closely with them and be a sort of perennial spot for all those people who go to the conventions but would like to go somewhere on the weekend that that the convention isn't happening. So I have lots of dreams for the gallery, and as I continue to acquire new pieces as well, I want to continue rotating those through the gallery, and as new movies come out, being able to ideally take something straight from the theater that's in movies now or streaming right now and put it right into the gallery. I think that would be a fun way not only to add material from classic films, but also to help promote films that are currently in circulation.